Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second plenary. I'm Francesca Bugliani Knox, formerly a lecturer at the University in Milan and subsequently at University College, London. Like everyone here, I imagine, I would like to renew my thanks to Georgetown University and to the Civiltà Cattolica for having organized and provided the resources that have made this conference possible. I'm a great admirer of Pope Francis, and it is therefore an enormous pleasure for me to introduce Father Antonio Spadaro, who will be talking about the Catholic literary imagination of Pope Francis. There are two reasons why Father Spadaro is eminently suited to this task. He is the editor-in-chief of La Civiltà Cattolica, consultant to the Dicastery of Culture and Education, member of the Synods of Bishops, a journalist, an expert of social communications, and an author in his own right. But together with these many commitments, Father Spadaro has written on all the reforming and prophetic aspects of Pope Francis' pastoral mission. His study of Pope Francis' magisterium has allowed Father Spadaro to emphasize the role that literature has played in Pope Francis' formation, as indeed Cardinal Tolentino de Mendoza pointed out yesterday afternoon, and to show how his appreciation of the arts in general permeates his teachings, homilies, and reflections. The second reason is that, like Pope Francis, Father Spadaro, as several of his books testify, himself recognizes the importance of creativity and of the religious imagination, something that makes him particularly receptive to Pope Francis' literary and artistic sensibilities. A curious, some might say providential series of circumstances led to Father Spadaro's engagement with Pope Francis' aesthetics, and also to my being here to introduce him this afternoon. Our imagination, the Pope has steadfastly maintained, tends to be stifled by the austerity of abstract concepts, and this impoverishment has become a serious obstacle to our faith. Well, that had been Father Spadaro's view too, some 15 years ago, when I first met him, 3 years before Bergoglio was elected Pope. As a literary critic, a theologian, he was writing for Civiltà Cattolica and had published a study of Pier Vittorio Tondelli's fiction in 1999, an essay discussing the purpose of literature, A che cosa serve la letteratura, 2002, and most importantly, La grazia della parola, a title that can be imperfectly translated as The Power of the Word, in 2006. In this book, he espoused Karl Rahner's thesis that to be able to listen to the poetic word was a prerequisite for being able to listen to the Word of God. At that time, many miles away, in London, I was reflecting and writing on similar topics and trying to build, in the academic world, a bridge between, on the one hand, imaginative literature, and on the other, philosophy, theology, and spirituality. On discovering our shared interests, Father Spadaro began engaging with the Power of the Word international project that had taken shape in 2010 at Heathrow College, one of the colleges that, at the time, made up the University of London and was run by Jesuits. The fruits of the first international conference was a volume edited by David Lonzel and myself, entitled Poetry and the Religious Imagination, and published by Routledge in 2015. Both Father Spadaro and Michael Paul Gallagher, S.J., contributed to the volume. With the election of Pope Francis, particularly after interviewing him in September 2013, Father Spadaro intuited how literature and the arts would come to play an essential role in the Pope's magisterium. how true that would prove to be. In an article that he and I co-authored for the 4th volume of the Power of the Word series, entitled Poetry, Philosophy and Theology in Conversation, Thresholds of Wonder, published in 2020, again by Routledge, we explored how the theme of wonder informed Pope Francis' literary imagination. In several publications and talks since then, Father Spadaro has elaborated on the theme of Pope Francis and literature in more detail and from different viewpoints. No one, then, could be more suited to help us here today, poets, authors, readers, and critics as we are, to understand how art and literature, whether Catholic or not, can be appreciated from a Catholic perspective, in the first instance, none other than that of Pope Francis. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. Thanks, all of you, to be here. I feel very glad and honored to have all of you here gathered at Civiltà Cattolica. This is my place. I've been here for 25 years, even too much maybe, but at least half of my life. And I'm very glad to share with you my experience of Pope Francis from a very peculiar point of view, which is the literary point of view. I want to start saying that there is a Spanish word which is very dear to Pope Francis. This word is desborde, or in the verbal form, desbordar. It's very difficult to translate it into other languages, always with the same word. We could say overtaking, or overflowing, or going beyond the age. Faced with some major problems, Pope Francis used to say that the way out is found by overflowing. In Spanish, is la salida se encuentra por desborde. He adds that we must broaden horizons. It's not enough to regulate life. We must open it to God, whose presence is always greater, overflowing. In the interview that Francesca mentioned, that Pope Francis gave to me in 2013 for La Civiltà Cattolica, just a few months after his election to the pontificate, he said about being a Jesuit, the mystical aura never defines its ages. Again, the word ages, age comes very often, but the mystical aura never, ever defines its ages. It does not complete the thought. The Jesuit must be a person of incomplete thinking, of open thinking. I was kept by the word incomplete thinking. According to Pope Francis, desborde is proper to poetry and narrative, which contains more life than the abstract logic. Francis made this vision explicit in a talk he gave to La Civiltà Cattolica on the occasion of the publication of issue 4000 of the magazine, when he said, I'm going to quote him, "That's why I like poetry so much. And when I can, I keep reading it. Poetry is full of metaphors. Understanding metaphors helps to make thinking agile, intuitive, flexible, sharp. One who has imagination does not stiffen, has a sense of humor, always enjoys the sweetness of mercy and inner freedom. He is able to open wide visions, even in narrow spaces. The thinking of the Church must recover genius." It's more or less what Cardinal Tolentino told us yesterday. The Church needs poets. And Pope Francis said, the thinking of the Church must recover genius. And Francis told me when I interviewed him again in 2016, the novel, literature, reads the human heart. It helps us embrace desire, splendor, and misery. It's not theory. It's helpful for preaching to know the heart. So 10 years after his election to the papacy, you remember that, March 13, 2013. So 10 years after his election, I would like to go in search of the formation of his thinking and pastoral attitude, which is marked by the dynamic of the desborde, of overflowing, of going over the age. We are doing so by retracing his readings. It will be a way to understand Jorge Mario Bergoglio's pontificate from a different perspective. I will try to give some pointers to build a map, a path, among the texts that have shaped his way of thinking. Pope Francis has always been passionate about literature. Novels and poetry accompanied him in his formation. In a 2009 interview, so before he was elected to the pontificate, he said that literature from a young age me gustaba mucho. I used to like it very much. In fact, his memories as a reader go back to the childhood, when his father read books aloud after dinner. There was no television at that time. As a young Jesuit, Bergoglio taught literature at the Colegio de la Inmaculada Concepción, a Jesuit school in Santa Fe, Argentina. There, he developed the conviction that creative experience is very relevant. He was just 28, and he had to get his students to study the classic of Spanish literature. He also began to get them to write. Eventually, he decided to ask Borges to read 2 short stories written by his students. So he was a teacher of creative writing when he was 28. He knew Borges' secretary, who had been his piano teacher. So Borges liked those stories very much. So Bergoglio suggested he write the introduction to that collection of novels. This experience of past has an echo even today. It is striking that Francis has written a preface to the poems of a young poet, Luca Milanese, pretty much unknown. He, in 2020, published a volume entitled Rime a sorpresa, Surprises Rhymes. It would not be remarkable, I think, to read a papal text juxtaposed with the work of a poet who has entered the culture and sensibility of entire generations, like, for example, Dante. And actually, he did. Bergoglio himself published an apostolic letter called Candor Lucis Aeterne to mark the 7th centenary of the death of the Sommo Poeta, Dante Alighieri. But it has never happened before that a pontiff would write a one-page introduction to the work of a young, unpublished poet. In his preface, Pope Francis notes that Milanese's poetry stems from a spontaneous ability to, he wrote, see connections even where they seemingly are known. He knows how to grasp in seemingly random things a new, different depth. So poetry makes one see links, connections, correspondences. I know from his students, because I interviewed some of the students of Pope Francis when he was 28. So I know from his students that Bergoglio, as a young professor, loved to teach Baudelaire, whom he has also quoted as a pope. Perhaps there is an echo of the symbolic density of the correspondence in his introduction to Milanese. It's also significant that he wanted to write on June 20, 1981, the preface to a collection of poems by the Argentine Jesuit poet Osvaldo Pol, entitled De Destierros y Moradas, of Exile and Dwellings. Francis wrote, so we are in 1981, and he was provincial. The poetic word has dwellings of flesh in the human heart, and at the same time feels the weight of wings that have not yet taken flight. I think this is wonderful. The poetic word has dwellings of flesh in human heart, and at the same time feels the weight of wings that have not yet taken flight. This is another important definition of poetry. It absorbs the feelings, the passions, the carnality of desire. And this is why its weight is not that of wings that once they have taken flight are no longer felt. I mean, so wings that have not yet taken flights. On the contrary, so the poem feels this weight because the wings still touch the heart. The earth, sorry. Well, touch the heart, of course, but the earth. This is very relevant. So why this poetic passion? Bergoglio knows that lack of imagination is a serious problem for faith. We lack powerful images that help us imagine the truths we believe. This is, for example, one of the reasons why he loves popular piety. It's a golden reservoir of strong images that are grafted deeply into the collective imagination of a people. It is in this sense that we should understand the appeal made by the pontiff in his preface to my book. I was very deeply honored by that. My book, The Divine Plot, Jesus in Reverse Angle. He wrote at the end of this preface to my book, I make an appeal. In this time of crisis of the world order, a time of war and great polarizations, of rigid paradigms, of serious climate and economic challenges, we now need the genius of a new language, of powerful stories and images, of writers, poets, and artists capable of shouting the gospel message to the world, of making us see Jesus. Making us see Jesus. The call was immediately taken up by director Martin Scorsese, who wrote a script about Jesus that could become a movie. One of the serious problems of faith for Bergoglio is that we cannot imagine the truths we believe. This is one of the major problems of faith today. We cannot imagine the truths we believe. We lack powerful images. So many times, in fact, as a pope, he has used and continues to use images taken from poetry, even in his most important documents. For example, in the apostolic exhortation Amoris Laetitia, dedicated to love in the family, Francis felt the need to use poetic language. And so he quoted Jorge Luis Borges, Ottavio Paz, and Mario Benedetti. In another exhortation, Querida Amazonia, he quoted as many as 17 writers and poets, mostly Amazonian and popular, but also Mario Vargas Llosa and Pablo Neruda. In his papal magisterium, Francis includes the poetic and symbolic logos as an integral part of his discourse. This is definitively significant. But there is a peculiar aspect of poetic expression that Bergoglio loves. I love tragic artists, Francis told me during my 2013 interview. On a couple of occasions, I also have had the opportunity to continue this conversation with the pontiff, talking about this or that writer. One example is Dostoevsky. I knew that the great Russian novelist was among Bergoglio's most beloved writers. He repeated this several times, including during the press conference on the flight back from Bahrain. But which work in particular does he favor? The brothers Karamazov? That is what I imagine, because he quoted them He quoted this work when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires. But when I asked directly, what do you like of Dostoevsky? Pope Francis replied, notes from underground. I was struck by that. Later, in my 2016 interview, he described it as a jewel. In this 1864 novel, the Russian writer describes a frustrated man who is resentful of a world that is despicable in his eyes, a man with no name and no qualities. Neither, this is Dostoevsky, neither bad nor good, neither dishonest nor honest, neither a hero nor an insect. Though aware of what good is, he sinks deeper and deeper into a state of wickedness amid unfulfilled desires and resolutions of revenge. So I want to dwell here on one aspect of this passion for tragedy, the fact that it testifies to the complexity and contradictory nature of human experience, the experience of life. Bergoglio loves tensions, you know that. He loves tensions, polar oppositions, as Romano Guardini, who was a great interpreter of Dostoevsky and had a great influence on Bergoglio's thought, called them polar oppositions. In Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky wrote that it's not necessarily 2 + 2 = 4, but could also be 2 + 2 = 5. In fact, 2 + 2 = 4 is no longer life, gentlemen, but the principle of death. This is Dostoevsky, of course. Calculating, conceptual, and abstract thinking fails to grasp life and its real connections and contradictions. After all, one of the cornerstones of Bergoglio's thinking is that reality always comes before the idea, and the complexity of the polyhedron is superior to the equidistances of the sphere. Did he learn this from Dostoevsky? I'm pretty sure he did, through the reading of Romano Guardini at least. This seems to me a crucial point for understanding Francis, because this infraction of the rigid logic postulated by Dostoevsky can also be seen at the basis of what Francis, in my interview, had called incomplete thinking or open-ended thinking, which has nothing rigid about it. Along the same lines is a reflection that Francis shared with the Jesuit of La Civiltà Cattolica, referring to Baudelaire, an author that the young Bergoglio, as I told you before, made his students study carefully. I learned this from the former Argentinian ambassador to the Holy See, who was his former student. So he told us, I was thinking of Baudelaire's verses about Rubens, where he writes that la vie afflue et s'agit sans cesse, comme l'air dans le ciel et la mer dans la mer. Yes, life is fluid and steers without ceasing as the air steers in the sky and the sea in the sea. He continued, life is not a black and white picture. It's a color picture. Some light and some dark, some muted and some vivid, but still nuances prevail. This is fantastic. So the need for incomplete thinking can be detected also in Francis' passion for the dystopian novel Lord of the World by Robert Hugh Benson. In this work, a charismatic world leader emerges and leads many to think that he represents the way beyond the divisions constituted, for example, by nations and religions into a broader and more inclusive humanism. Here appear then the fruits of the lie of an abstractly humanitarian ideal of so-called single thinking, or as Francis called it on his trip to Bahrain, isolated thinking. On April the 4th, 2005, Bergoglio wrote on the imperialist conception of globalization. And to describe it, he said that it is conceived as a perfect, clean sphere. All peoples merge into a uniformity that nullifies the tension between diversities. So Benson predicted, he said that, so he quoted Benson. So when he speaks about international politics, he quotes literature. Benson predicted all this in his famous novel, Lord of the World. This globalization constitutes the most dangerous totalitarianism of postmodernity. It's complicated, but it's striking. So he quotes Benson for talking about globalization and for understanding it. So incomplete thinking, whereby 2 + 2 do not always make 4, is the opposite of globalized, isolated, and single thinking. Bergoglio makes his own the definition of a classical, this is another chapter. So which kind of literature he likes? So the tragic one, but also the popular one. Bergoglio makes his own the definition of a classical work that comes from Cervantes. And this is the definition given by Cervantes. Children have it in their hands. Young people read it. Adults understand it. And old people praise it. This is the definition of classical work given by Cervantes. The classic work is that which everyone can somehow perceive as their own, not a small group of refined connoisseurs. This let us understand a fundamental aspect of the pontiff's literary passion. The classic for Bergoglio is always popular. But by popular, it also means that it is a connection with the people, because it expresses their genius. This leads him, in his apostolic journeys, to refer to writers and poets from the places he visits, such as Miklos Radnoti in Hungary, or even Abai in Kazakhstan. In Colombia, it's Gabriel Garcia Marquez. In Chile, Gabriela Mistral. In Mexico, Octavio Paz. This link between people and art is evident in Bergoglio's love for a work that, by his own admission, is not a masterpiece. The Argentine epic poem Martín Fierro, written by José Hernández in 1872. Bergoglio wrote an extensive reflection on this work, in which he sees a narrative, a kind of staging of the drama of the constitution of a collective and inclusive sentiment. The invitation to read the national poem is meant to awaken he wrote, desire to keep alive that dream of a homeland of brothers and sisters that has guided so many men and women in this land. In fact, this work gives shape to the desire for a society in which everyone finds a place. The porteño trader, the coastal gaucho, the northern shepherd, the northeastern artisan, the native and the immigrant, insofar as none of them wishes to have everything for him or herself, expelling the others from the land. His accents in speaking of Martín Fierro are reminiscent of the democratic and popular romanticism of another great American poet, Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman, contemporary of Hernandez, who feels the Dakota carpenter and the Californian miner, the mechanic and the bricklayer, the boatman and the showmaker. So the Argentine mosaic is no less than that of the United States because of immigration. It should not be forgotten that Bergoglio is son of immigrants. This is why it's necessary to talk about Bergoglio's great interest in another great author, which is not well known as it should. Leopoldo Marescial was born in he died in 1970. A classic writer of the Argentine literature, because he well expressed the value of the unity of a people on the basis of diversity and mestizaje. I don't know how to translate this word in English, but mestizaje, probably you understand that. Yeah. Mixing. Yeah. Francis had told me about Marescial in 2013 interview. He told me about Marescial masterpiece, Adán Buenos Aires, published in 1948, where he described the city of the brothers, Philadelphia, the city of the brothers. The work narrates a symbolic 3-day voyage by the poet Adán within the geography of a metaphysical Buenos Aires, a great melting pot of races and languages, a productive and cheerful metropolis with countless immigrants, Spanish, Italians, Germans, Russians, Syro-Lebanese, and so on. Marescial helped Bergoglio reflect on and imagine the value of mestizaje, which he explained well to the Jesuits in Mozambique. He said to the Jesuits, meeting them in a private meeting in Mozambique, mixing, this has come from Marescial, mixing makes you grow. It gives you new life. It develops racial mixing, change, and gives originality. The mixing of identities is what we have experienced, for example, in Latin America. There we have everything, Spanish and Indian, the missionary and the conqueror, the Spanish lineage, people's mixed heritage. Building walls means in condemning yourself to death. We can't live asphyxiated by a culture as clean and pure as an hospital operating room, aseptic and not microbial. So we should be microbial for being alive. How much imagination the statements deploy. But there is also the description of Philadelphia, the city of brothers, that is striking in Adán Buenos Aires. Mixture and differences composed in harmony build citizenship. And thus Philadelphia, which Marescial writes, is the city of brothers among the metropolises of the world. A peaceful and happy multitude will walk its streets. End of quotation. As the rose reigns among flowers, again he wrote, so the city of brothers will reign among the metropolises of the world. The city is home to all who live it in their differences and intersections. How can we not see here the background of the encyclical Fratelli Tutti? So his magisterium is grounded on poetry and literature. Therefore, art is not a laboratory for experimenting with cultural and expressive dynamics. Instead, it's part of the flow of history, part of humanity's journey on earth. It is an advanced frontier, but not an elitist club. In this sense, it's illuminating how important the work of the French writer Joseph Maleg is to Bergoglio. Francis said in 2013 interview, I see holiness in the people of God, their daily holiness. There is a middle class of holiness that we can all be part of, the one Maleg talks about. Again, he's writing about spirituality, and he quotes a writer, a French writer, Joseph Maleg. Somebody called him the Catholic Proust, but I encouraged you to discover his work. Born in 1876 and dying in 1940, Maleg is known for his unfinished trilogy Pierre Noire, La classe moyenne du salut. describing what he means by the middle class of holiness, Francis manifested this link to Maleg's pages at the beginning of Gaudete et Exultate, which is another apostolic exhortation made by him. The apostolic exhortation on the call to holiness in the contemporary world. We are not far from the reasons why he read another great novel, I Promessi Sposi, The Betrothed, by Alessandro Manzoni. 4 times. He read I Promessi Sposi 4 times. He told me that, at least. He had spoken about it with a very personal recollection, saying, "My grandmother, when I was a child, taught me by heart the beginning of this book." And also he said, "Often my father would recite parts of the Betrothed to us from memory and then explain them to us." So grandmother and father, both of them know the beginning of the Promessi Sposi by heart. And so Bergoglio's passion for Manzoni's novel is the result of readings in the family context, of personal memories that have the warmth of affection, of the presence of his grandmother and father. Manzoni's work is the novel of mechanical and petty business people who become instruments of the divine providence. Stories and history are intertwined, traversing tribulation. On this historical level, human machinations are revealed and God's consolation are experienced. Lucia, who rightfully belongs to the middle class of holiness, is persecuted by human meanness. It's she who carries the proclamation of God's mercy. This is the profound meaning of the dramatic encounter with the captor, the unnamed, l'innominato, to whom the announcement of God's mercy is made. What can I, a petty person, demand, if not that you show mercy to me? God forgives many things for a work of mercy, says Lucia in the Promessi Sposi. Bergoglio is clearly impressed by works that display mercy, a literature of mercy. Dante, too, is for Bergoglio a poet of God's mercy, which, as he writes in his apostolic letter Candor Lucis Aeterne, always offers the possibility of change, conversion, new self-awareness, and discovery of the path to true happiness. This is evidenced, for example, by the figure of the Emperor Trajan, a pagan, but placed by Dante in the Canto 20 of Paradise, or by King Manfred, excommunicated, but by Dante put in the purgatory, not the inferno, who thus recalls his own end and the divine verdict this way. But infinite, this is purgatory canto, the third canto. But infinite goodness has such great arms that it takes what turns to it. This is a perfect summary of Francis' vision of God mercy. So, it's time to close, I guess, yes. Interweaving the reading of Hernandez, Maleg, Dostoevsky, and Manzoni, one senses the humanity Bergoglio has in his heart. It extends as if within a square. It starts from the straightforward folk dimension of Renzo and Lucia, Promessi Sposi, to the gaucha humanity of the characters in Martin Fierro's epic. It continues from La classe moyenne de la sainteté to the brutality of the social life of the Dostoevskian anti-hero, the man of the underground. So I tried just to give you an example of how the Bergoglio work, pastoral work, and the Bergoglio vision can be seen from a different point of view, the literary point of view, since Paul Francis is a great reader of poetry and novels. So by constructing a map of Bergoglio's reading, we can better understand his vision as pastor and perhaps even discover the roots of his way of understanding the life and the world. Thank you.